Hello. Video.
Hey, Mike.
Okay. Hi. Hopefully I'll be able to share the screen.
You better be able to. This is a lot to talk about.
Okay, I'm going to test, see if I can find the files that I have. So.
Good. That's a good idea.
And they're all down there. I think there's one.
There's the one. Where's the other one? That's okay. That's the package. And then the other one's not there.
Go full screen. They're down here. So if you click on any of those, ask if they can see it.
That, and then
ask them if they can see it.
How do we go back to the Google? Oh, this. Okay.
Ask if they can see it.
So that's now this one. So I'm going to go back to the other one. Okay.
But can they see it?
I didn't share it yet.
We can't see it, Mike.
No, I haven't shared it yet. I'm just trying to get to the file.
Okay.
Can they now?
There you go.
Your file?
It's working.
See
Oh
it.
my God, I think I may have got it right.
Co-pilot. Great.
It only took 6 months.
6? Okay, I have it that it's 6:30. So if we can begin our November 17th Finance and Facilities Committee meeting. On the Zoom with me today are Mike Berlingo, Treasurer, Steve Barrett, Superintendent, Matt Campbell, and Brian Hairston and Burl Piccolantonio, school board members. I think I have it right. And we have 4 agenda items for discussion this evening. And as usual, we will start with the October fiscal year to date financial reports, and I'll hand it over to Mr. Berlingo.
Okay, thank you, Daphne. First item is just to review the results through October. See if I can get this centered. Numbers here might be a little bit small, but cash balances, in total for the district are at 50.3 million. General fund at 26.4 versus 22.4 last year. Receipts were 4.5 million. For the month, 1.6 million increase from estimated revenues versus prior year, about 400,000 higher. So somewhat consistent. Tax receipts are 800,000 higher, and but it's somewhat offset by lower state funding. And this has been the trend because state funding last year was cut at the end of the year. So we're tracking under state funding since we've been cut this year the same amount as last year. We do expect tax collections to be slightly lower in the second half because of the potential. We didn't see necessarily a large reduction in uncollectible taxes in the first half because we did anticipate that there would be some of those due to COVID and the shutdown of the economy. But there could be a bit of a time lag there. So, and we've discussed that previously. We do think that maybe in the second half, we will see a slight reduction. So that was kind of incorporated into the forecast, and we can discuss that further when we get into the forecast. Non-operating revenues were 400 some thousand higher. We did receive there was 500 plus $1,000 sitting in the runout reserve related to the self-insurance fund. And basically claims at this point have dwindled to nothing. So there is potentially still a legal requirement that we maintain those dollars, but we did take those back as a return of prior year expenditure. We received those funds in October. On the expenditure side, we're 1.1 million under estimates. And that is primarily, again, half of that in salaries, mostly because we have not yet trued up in the adjustments for year-to-date settlements of contracts. Most of that will all occur in in November. And there will be maybe some that occurs in December, but for the most part, we should catch up with salaries in the month of November. So it would be pretty much on par with estimates at that point. State software redesign was something that we had planned to do in the October timeframe, but that was delayed because we could not participate in training due to activities in the district. So that's been put off to the spring of 2021. And then just to review, there's some appropriation and revenue adjustments. Basically, we're increasing appropriations for general fund special education services of 400,000. There will be another increase in next month's appropriations, as well as some additional revenues related to that return of insurance expenditures. Most other items are all increases in appropriations and in revenue related to carryovers in grant activity. So those are all being processed this month.
So Mike, this, not to stop you, but this is where I had the question, because in our agenda for Thursday night, the figure is not a $400,000 increase. It's 1.3 million.
1.3, yeah. The difference is that in addition to the special ed tuition, there were additional John Peterson and autism grant activity that we expect to see increased deductions from our foundation settlement. And we also see an increase in the number of students that are enrolling in some online academies. And the other is we increased appropriations relative to COVID expenditures for PPE. So in speaking with Scott Lofton, he anticipates that we will be incurring additional expenses over and above what we originally anticipated.
So this number is really 1.3 million, not 400,000.
Correct.
Okay.
I have a question related to what you just said, Mr. Verlingo, but the question probably doesn't go to you. It probably goes to Mr. Barrett. I know that you said that at least part of that is related to an increase in students enrolling in other online schools. At some point soon, I would like to see some numbers about, I guess, showing the number of students that we've had either enrolling in an online school program that is different than what we're offering, or notification to homeschool kids. So I know that that's related to what you said, Mr. Verlingo, but I don't know that, I'm not sure who can provide that information, but I would like to see an update for this year on those numbers at some point soon.
Okay. I could certainly provide historical information relative to the actual number of students that have been in those programs. So there was just a large uptick in October.
So the homeschool piece wouldn't affect funding necessarily, right, Mike?
It would reduce the foundation because we're allocated dollars per student based on enrollment. So
Yeah,
those kids are unenrolled. We lose about 1,700 and change per student.
yeah, it wouldn't be the full amount.
Correct.
And many of them have, they trickle in, so we're almost double what we were last year. So about a little over, the last time I checked, and I signed a couple more today, it was a little over 200 students, and normally we're about 100. For home.
I think those are numbers that we should be watching, both the homeschool numbers and the numbers of students. And I understand that they impact us financially in a little bit different way, but I just am thinking back to the resolution that we passed several years ago. And one of the things that we said that when we passed that resolution is that we feel like, I think if I'm remembering the contents of that resolution, I think one of the things that we said is that we feel like it is our obligation to make sure that we have a good understanding if people make those choices, why they're making those choices, because they do have a negative financial implication for the district, both homeschool choice and choice for charter schools. Again, I understand that they negatively impact the district differently, but that's something that we said that we were committed to understanding those reasons and kind of doing what we could to work with those families to encourage, as we can, to keep them part of our Gehanna family.
Yes.
Okay. The next chart kind of just gives a historical breakdown or summary of revenues and expenditures, local versus state. As you can see, the local share has increased over time. That trend is continuing in that, this year we're projecting about 78, I think 0.2% of local share, and the state share is somewhat decreasing. Let me go to this slide. This is the summary of our cash balances, which shows our investment activity also. So the majority of our funds are always kept invested in some type of vehicle, either bonds, commercial paper, CDs, etc., Star Ohio, or Heartland Money Market. One of the benefits to Heartland is they do give us a premium on the interest rate to keep funds locally. So it always exceeds the Star rate by, in this case, was significant amount, 79 versus 20. But that will be dropping because they do adjust it every quarter. So that would be dropping to 25 basis points. Most of the funds are shorter term. Again, based on the forecast, we need to have funds available. The construction funds will all be used within the next 12 months or so once we finish up construction of the new Lincoln, and the rest of the balances we just try to keep invested at the highest rate possible. Looking at the detailed chart of meter investments, you can see that we still have a number of CDs that are yielding very high interest rates, 3%, 2.5%, 2.8 or so, which extend out to FY 23, 24, and 25. So we will at least maintain interest income over that period. The yields have dwindled to close to nothing when you're looking at shorter term securities. So I'm typically reinvesting at a 2-year horizon at the 20 to 21 basis point level at this point.
Mike, is the Heartland, do they reset on a calendar quarter?
I think the The date of change is 11/24, so 11, it occurs in the next week or so. So when we first initially set it up, it was just an arbitrary date that we agreed to, get a premium on investments, and they just reset it every quarter. So overall, financial results are somewhat on par with expectations at this point. Although we are seeing, there is increased expenditures for PPE and other things related to COVID. The hope is that we will see maybe potentially some additional funding, from the state and or the federal government. If they do come to some agreement in terms of another stimulus package, I would hope that there's money available for schools to use for that purpose. Any questions on financial results? Okay. The next thing on the agenda was just an update on the bus purchase grant. We did apply for and received a grant of $26,934, but that had to be used this year to purchase a new bus, which would also then require you to remove a bus from service. So we did place a purchase order at the end of October for a new bus in the $80,000 range. This offsets about $27,000 of that cost. So I had sent an email and requested that we basically accelerate the purchase of a bus because we did not have any in this forecast, in the plan for this year. And I think the decision to do that, obviously we get a significant discount by using that grant. So just to give you an update on that, that is in process.
Can you tell me again how much the purchase price is?
It was somewhere, I don't have the purchase order in front of me, but it was 80 plus thousand. Maybe I'm thinking about 82,000 for the bus.
And then if we have to take a bus out of service, is that a bus that we will sell and receive some?
It would either be sold
price?
Or scrapped, for something. Yeah, you always typically receive some funds when you dispose of a bus.
And we have any idea of what that might be?
I'm not familiar. I know in my prior district, because I've not been involved here with the sale of a bus. The prior district, we would only receive maybe $1,000 to $2,000 in scrap value.
No.
The third item is purchasing limit for board agenda items. Our policy requires board approval on any purchases in excess of $50,000 and also certain bidding requirements. That's policy purchasing and bidding PO 632, 6320. There's sometimes confusion on my part, so I just want a clarification. The board would like to see contracts on the agenda or items to be purchased in excess of $10,000, but we don't necessarily need board approval prior to moving ahead and making that purchase. So the policy is somewhat in conflict with what I have been, where I understand the board would like to see on the board agendas. So is it strictly for informational purposes? We would like to see all purchases and contracts over $10,000. or do we actually need board approval? Because sometimes things need, or they need to be acted on fairly quickly, as opposed to waiting for the next board meeting.
Steve, what's been practice in previous districts for you?
I mean, I've always liked to make sure that we put things on the board agenda just for transparency. There are some times that if you have an emergency, gas leak or something that you need to spend money on, that you like Mike said, you need to make an emergency, purchase or get an emergency service. But I mean, I don't think that it's a problem having things on the agenda, even if it's less than the threshold Mike mentioned. I think it's just a good practice to have, but I've seen it done both ways, not having those things on and having them on. But I think we've been kind of making it a practice to try to do that.
Right. What do other board members think?
So I just want to be clear, the practice that we have been going by is putting everything on the board agenda, not just for informational purposes, but for board approval, unless there's a situation where everything over 10,000 or over, unless it's a situation where there's an emergency and it's under 50,000. Am I understanding what our current practice is correctly?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. And I think even sometimes we can put those on. It just is after the fact, just to let the public know what we've had to do. We haven't had too many of those.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a board that feels pretty strongly about transparency. So I guess I would not want to see us, that was two negatives, but I would like us to continue the practice to err on the side of putting things on the board agenda. Is it causing problems? I guess that's what I'm trying to understand. Are we running into circumstances that
there was the latest situation was a freezer that needed to be overhauled because it had stopped working, and in order to keep the food from perishing, the work needed to be done very quickly, and it was like an $11,000 overhaul to fix this.
Okay, so it sounds to me like in that circumstance, you would have the authorization to go ahead and make the purchase, but we would still like to see it come on the board agenda, even if it is after the fact.
Mm-hmm. There was another issue relative to, I believe, there was PPE or uniform that needed to be acquired through one of the services that do that. And the contract, there was a question as to whether or not we could sign the contract, prior to board approval, but we needed to kind of move quickly. So I guess in that situation, that might also fall under the emergency situation, that it can be actually, purchase order can be done, and then we would get board approval later or put it on as an information item.
I think that's the other piece is it being put on the agenda for approval or put on the agenda for informational purposes? Because I feel like we end up approving things that maybe they don't need approved. Could that be a situation?
Yeah, I think we could just point out.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Mike. Sorry.
No, I was just saying, in that case, yeah, the dollar amount was less significant. The problem was that they required I think it was a 2-year commitment, and usually anything in excess of a year, a multi-year agreement, must get board approval. Again, it was one of these situations where we needed to move quickly in order to get the service in order to open schools or have, the uniforms available. And I forget which exact group it was, Steve, that needed those.
Okay, so to summarize, I think the decision-making up to 50,000 is in the administrator's hands, right? But we want it to appear on the agenda, all purchases like that over 10,000, right? Or have we been doing them all? All have been appearing on the agenda for informational purposes. Is that agreeable?
We've been doing ones less than 10,000, I believe.
Yes.
Okay.
I think that's agreeable. I think that provides a lot of transparency and it allows us to have a discussion at the board meeting.
Are you good with that, Brian?
Yeah, I'm okay with it because, 9 times out of 10, the items are taken all of, so I don't know how much we're going to really be talking about or discussing it either if we're accepting all the items to be approved at once. So.
Okay.
Okay.
Does that give you what you need, Michael, on number 3?
Yes.
Okay, great.
All right, so the last item is the November 5-year forecast. And there's a PowerPoint that I will kind of run through, just highlighting some of the items that are considered in compiling the forecast and some information relative to revenues and expenditures and cash position based upon this particular view of the forecast. So one of the things, as you know, we're kind of in a waiting period here in terms of the levy. So we cannot add revenues to a forecast that have not been officially, where the levy results have not been officially certified. Those amounts that would increase our millage or have not yet been approved. So, we're kind of in this holding period until, the votes are certified and then the recount occurs. And hopefully then by the end of November, which is when we need to file the forecast, we will have those results. So this particular forecast is taking the position that the levy is not going to pass. And then we also can show a view where the additional revenues from the levy will result in a much better cash position. So back a year, 2 years ago, House Bill 166 froze our state funding at the FY19 levels for 2 years. But as you know, in May of 2020, due to budget shortfalls, the state did end up cutting education and they reduced school funding by a significant amount. Our share was $1.667 million. And that was for both FY20 at the end of the year plus fiscal year 21. What we are projecting, because the state revenues have improved, they're actually exceeding estimates as the economy has recovered, as people have returned to work. State budgets are, as I said, better than projected. So we are anticipating that the funding for FY22 will increase back to 95% of the FY19 level, and then be back at full funding for 23 to 25. That's assuming the economy continues to recover. If, for example, shutdowns, as the governor has, implemented more, let's say, controls relative to masks, and he's not, at least at this point, wanting to close down the economy again. But if that were to occur, then obviously we're going to see lower state funding in the future. Another item that, just to note, was casino revenues, which typically bring in several $100,000 a year to the district. We are losing $400,000 over the forecast period based upon the current forecast. On property taxes, we are on par with prior years. We were expecting higher delinquencies due to the pandemic, but that did not materialize. Again, there could be a timing issue here. So we are projecting a slightly lower collection rate for the first half of 21 to be somewhat conservative. And let's hopeful that no additional shutdowns occur. The growth rate in tax revenue over the forecast period is approximately 1.3% per year. That is the result of additional homes being constructed, plus an estimate of potentially revaluation adjustments that will occur in 3 years. Otherwise, tax revenues would typically be flat over the period. One of the benefits, Gahanna is growing. It's a benefit in that we're growing our tax base. It also does bring in more students and put more of a strain on our budget as additional students come to the district. Expenditures due to pandemic impacts are in excess of previous estimates. If you recall, in the May forecast, we were assuming that we would be back in school for this school year under somewhat normal circumstances. That did not occur. We started out with the distance learning. We're currently in hybrid, and right now, at least, the hybrid is continuing. As to whether or not that continues or we end up back in school full time is to be seen. The learning model, well, also headcount additions. Due to our growth, we have layered in some additional headcount into the forecast as enrollment continues to increase. The learning model has impacted food service in that I have added an advance to the food service fund this year based upon results through October. We are significantly negative compared to where we normally would be. Even though we are receiving some additional federal funding, it's not looking as though we will be able to break even this year. The levy, again, is unclear in terms of whether or not it will pass or fail. So hopefully, again, we will find out something relatively soon on that. And we are operating below our 60-day cash reserve requirement, but that was something we were planning to increase reserves annually to eventually get up to that level. If you look at what drives the forecast, some of the items would be inflation. We cost increase year to year. I think most everyone knows that inflation is somewhat a given, unless we have a significant economic downturn, in which case you could potentially see deflation in some areas, but it is an impact to our budget on an annual basis. The number of programs offered, curriculum offerings in terms of expanding offerings is certainly a driver of our cost. And the third thing would be pretty much enrollment. Is that increasing or decreasing? In districts where it's decreasing, they have maybe the potential luxury of having dollars that are from state funding, which do not necessarily decrease, although they have less enrollment. In our case, we are seeing a significant increase in enrollment. That puts a strain on our budget because we don't necessarily see huge increases from the state in funding. Since we are a capped district, we are currently receiving about $4.5 million less than what the state formula would say we are entitled to. There is a proposal called the Fair School Funding Initiative that's currently being or working its way through the legislature. And that, based on projections, would effectively make us whole in terms of the funding loss that we currently are experiencing. The problem is that that particular initiative is needing about $1.6 billion in additional state funding to make it happen. And I think at this point, given the state budget, that is very unlikely to occur anytime in the near future. So if we look at enrollment, which is a huge driver of our cost, we're projecting to add 579 students through 2025. And you can see that would translate into, if I use an average of 30 per classroom, even though we typically only have 20, say to 25 in a classroom, some of those kids would populate other classrooms, not necessarily all be going into one. So estimated about 19 additional teaching staff to cover that enrollment. So the staff forecast, we have Lincoln Elementary, which will be coming online next school year. The original forecast from about a year ago had an additional administrator plus 9 staff members. Additional staff throughout the district, another 10 to accommodate the 19 needed for the enrollment growth. Typically, we do experience about 8 retirements per year. That number could vary given the current environment and with COVID, and there's a potential maybe we see some additional retirements, and the fact that you would replace a more senior staff with a less experienced staff typically tends to reduce the operating expenditures. But we usually assume we're going to net 0 in that, at least in terms of the head count. We're also anticipating additional classified staff to handle additional students, additional bus runs. There are bus drivers, maintenance, and custodial staff built into the forecast, a total of 18 over the 5-year period. And the cost of that incremental staff, excluding Lincoln, because I assume that we would continue to staff that school, because we are, Steve, I believe, looking to redistrict and move students into that facility. So the cost of the additional staff, excluding Lincoln, is about $2.2 million in the forecast. Our revenues are the blue line, the expenditures are the red line. We have been slightly above, revenues have exceeded expenditures by a small amount the last 3 fiscal years. We are expecting this fiscal year for 2021 to be negative and then continue to be negative. As you know, our revenues typically grow at a much smaller rate than expenditures. And most of that is due to the fact that we don't gain very much income when it comes to revaluation and adjustments to property values because of the House Bill 920 reduction factors. The green line, which is ending cash, basically goes negative in fiscal 2023, and that accelerates over the next couple of years.
But Mike, with regard to the expenses for fiscal year 21, a lot of that is COVID related, right? We didn't plan to have a loss in 21, right?
That's correct. We did anticipate that, like say, for example, some of the funding from the federal government and the state could be used for other expenditures. But since that has not occurred, the amount is basically going 100% towards COVID-related expenditures, plus additional funds that we are anticipating, which is $500,000 I added to the appropriations, or I'm going to add to the appropriations.
So we've got the $1.6 million reduction in state funding, right?
Correct.
And then about 1.6 million of COVID expenses so far in fiscal year 21.
Correct.
So those two pieces are why the red line is shifting over the blue line. I think that's very important to note, right?
It is, yes. If you look at our breakdown of revenues, local sources about 79% versus 21 state. That's consistent with history. And the foundation brings in about 15%. So in terms of Gahanna's overall school funding, we are much more reliant on our local taxpayers than some other districts may be in the state.
But Mike, when I looked at the 2021, I guess that's just year to date, we have 81.2% coming from local and 18.8 from state.
That's true, but I do anticipate that to shift back to more normal by end of year.
Even with the 1.6 million cut?
Yes.
All right, thank you.
I'll look at it again, but that's what, I'm forecasting at this point. So something in line with what it has been historically. So if we look at some of the challenges to revenue, House Bill 166, in terms of the cut that the cut that we experienced this past year and this current year, the increases in COVID cases could stall the recovery. Again, hopefully, we will not be shutting down the economy, but if that does occur, then certainly there'll be negative consequences. I think the school funding, our revenues don't increase with inflation, primarily due to House Bill 920 millage reductions. Inflation and enrollment growth will most always outpace any increases we receive. And distance learning and hybrid education models have negative impacts to, some of the local receipts like dues, fees, tuition, athletics, and food service. So, we are seeing a significant reduction in athletic receipts because, we're not having the number of games and, crowds and things attending. Food service obviously is less because kids are not, as many kids are not in school buying lunches. So there are kind of other things that occur or negative consequences to, the educational model that's employed, at least from a financial perspective. If we look at expenditures, running at about 78% of our budget for wages and benefits, slightly lower than average, which is approximately 80%. That is mostly due to the increased COVID costs. So we're experiencing more contractual services and supply costs than what we normally would have. So the percentage of wages and benefits are lower as compared to the total. Our cash balances, which is ending cash with the reserves, as you can see in fiscal year 2023, assuming this levy fails and we do not replace it with another ask, we're basically down to zero cash in fiscal 2023, and we go negative 25 days and then 65 days for the balance of the forecast period.
Now, does this, are you calculating this with a 5 million flat reserve or?
Correct.
So.
Keeping the reserve at 5 million.
Okay.
Forecast period.
So 2024 would be the first year that the reserve would be used up and it would still be negative.
Correct.
Okay.
So basically, we would need to make significant cuts prior to that period since we cannot go negative. So a summary of the revenues and expenditures. If you look at the forecast currently, we're looking at a $2 million deficit this fiscal year, again, assuming no levy passage. 2.5 next year, 5.4, 8.9, 13.2. Those losses accelerate. This does not take into account any expenditure reductions. So this is our current operating forecast without any reductions anticipated. The cash balance will drop from 12 million down to 2 million in 2024. I'm sorry, excluding the levies, the actual cash balance would be 10 million down to negative 7 million in 2024. Encumbrances plus reserve of 5 million and 750 of estimated encumbrances at the end of the year. So you can see with the reserve, we actually go negative in fiscal year 2023, the unreserved fund balance. So if that were to occur, where the 4.26 million, a 4.26 mil levy fails, we'd be looking at potential reductions, which initially we had thought would be in the 3 to 3.5 million range, which is what typically it would have been, but that was based on a lower reserve amount of 3 million. And it also did not include some of the additional expenditures that we're seeing, related to the PPE and the additional loss in revenue for potential homeschool and those activities. So I layered in some of those costs, which now increases the reductions needed to 4.2 million per year. That would need to start occurring in fiscal year 22 in order to eliminate the negative cash balance of 12.6 and maintain a 5 million reserve. The 4.26 mil levy was originally designed to carry us 4 years through fiscal year 2024. If the levy passes, revenues, if you look at line 11.30 near the bottom, those are the anticipated revenues from the levy that it would bring in. The actual forecast, the change in the forecast would be that if we get certification that the levy does pass, those dollars would basically move up to the revenue line and be reflected in tax revenues for the district. So the line down there would go away, but it would tend to just move up to revenues. Based on the 4.26 mil levy and adding in the additional expenditures in fiscal year 2024, we end up with 54.4 days of cash plus reserve. Our target is 60. So those additional expenditures that have been layered in have caused us to experience a shortfall of 5.6 days of cash on hand. Given that's 4 years away, I think it's a relatively minor problem at this point because certain activities or things may occur in the next 6 to 12 months, which would change that forecast amount. For example, food service may not experience as large a loss, and that would reduce the amount of transfer. The number of students coming may be a little bit less. Maybe we need less additional staff. So I'm not too concerned about that being a problem at this point. But if you look down at what that means in terms of getting back to a 60-day cash reserve level, we would need to still initiate reductions of about 573,000 per year in order to get us back to a 60-day cash in FY24. I would not recommend, that action take place if the levy passes until we have another year of experience in terms of what the actual revenues and costs will be. There's many assumptions built into the forecast in terms of the number of housing starts, how much growth we'll see in new construction, what the estimates are for the revaluation and the update that occurs every 3 years. And if those numbers are higher than what we anticipate, that would wipe out the need to actually make the reductions. So I think it'd be premature to actually make reductions of that amount at this point in time. And that's the end of what I have in the presentation.
So Mike, I know I exceeded my quota of questions earlier today, but I did come up with one more. On the capital outlay line 3.050, we did an advance purchase of Chromebooks last fiscal year of, I think, $350,000, right?
Yes.
Closer to $500,000. Which one?
I thought it was 300, and so it basically we borrowed. That money is allocated in the PI fund. So there's two components to the capital budget. One is in PI, the other is in the IT. So IT accounts for most of the forecasted capital items that are on that line. The other funds come out of the PI budget, which the PI is not part of the general fund. And they have, I believe, 300,000 per year allocated for Chromebooks out of that line.
Well, we bought, I remember the number, 2005, I think, new Chromebooks. So I think it was closer to 600,000.
That my recollection was $500,000, right? We took 350 from PI and then 250-ish from the general fund that was earmarked in fiscal year 21. So I would expect to see, is that how we go from,
Yeah, computer replacement in the PI fund is 350,000 per year. Is what's allocated, and let's see, in the
I want to know where we're getting credit for the 250,000 we spent last fiscal year in this fiscal year's budget.
Well, in FY21 the capital budget is less. It's 726, I believe.
62. Okay.
762, correct.
So that 762 is all IT non-Chromebook? What are we spending it on?
Well,
We just upgraded our capacity, right?
Yeah, so we just upgraded our bandwidth so that, with Meta and, that was, I think, close to 100,000. We'll get the exact number on that.
Yeah.
It's definitely Chromebook repairs have become a greater expense. We purchased cameras for over 500 classrooms so that we could do the broadcasting and the live streaming. Some teachers have requested things like amplifiers, so when they're speaking with a mask on, they can hear better. Kids could hear them better. We also had a shortage of call them Elmos or ladybugs. They're document cameras that you can solve problems on and project to a screen so kids can see them. So there was purchases for those as well. So there were quite a few purchases that we made that we weren't planning to make because of the learning model.
So is that part of the 1.5 million of fiscal year 2020? Or is that in, I mean, we used to have $350,000 as the capital outlay, right? On the general fund after we passed the PI.
Mm-hmm.
And now it looks like the run rate is $1 million. And so I'm trying to understand, there's very few places on our 5-year forecast that we can manage, right? And because when I look on the 5-year forecast, purchase services went up basically 3 million, right? Supplies and materials have gone up 1 million. And I think all of this stuff is probably related to COVID, but then we have it in the run rate for the remaining 4 years. So is it something that is now going to be part of our permanent culture, or is it a 1-year anomaly? I guess that's my real question.
Some of it is a 1-year anomaly. If you look at FY21, for example, purchase services are 14.6 million.
Mm-hmm.
It's a 13.8 in FY22. Same thing with supplies, goes from 2.8 to 2.2. So I did account for some of that increase for FY21, and I took it out of FY22 because I don't expect it to continue. And therefore the run rate does not reflect all of that increase. The other thing was that in capital, we've in 18, it was 832,000, 19 was 854, 20 was unusually high at 1.5 million. The IT spend includes things like labs, computers for labs, support staff, teachers, a backup server, switches. There's a number of items in addition to what Steve mentioned, some of the unusual additional items we had to buy this year. So there are some normal recurring type things that are in the PI forecast for capital. And we can review that in more detail if you'd like.
Does anyone else have questions on the 5-year forecast? Sorry, I had a phone call coming through. Okay.
So
on Thursday, we will find out the certification results tomorrow morning from the levy election. So on Thursday, I guess if it's close, right, and the recount is required, then we will be forced to go with the levy failing submission for the month of November, which we can then refile in the month of December if the recount comes out in our favor. Correct?
Mm-hmm.
Do the board members know what I'm saying here? Okay.
We'll know at the Board of Election meeting tomorrow, that's at 9:30, we will know whether or not there's going to be a mandatory recount. We'll know that tomorrow morning.
Yeah. Right. So based on that information will be the direction that we take on Thursday night with regard to which 5-year forecast is in front of us. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yes.
Okay,
So what I will do based upon the information we obtain or receive tomorrow, if it's positive and we anticipate the levy will pass, I can recalculate the forecast with the additional revenues, and that's what we can adopt. The only potential would be if a recount. Okay, let me step back. If the recount is not necessary, then it's a given it would pass, assuming it's passing. If a recount is necessary, then we're going to file the levy as though it failed, and then we're going to.
Yeah, I have I guess a question about that, but I'll let you finish first.
Okay, so if we don't have a definitive answer tomorrow, then we would file the forecast as though the levy does not pass. And then if it ends up passing anytime between now and the end of November, we could recalculate the forecast and I can resubmit it. We're allowed to update the forecast, with the state, but we must meet the November 30 deadline. So if for any reason, if it was a recount and we didn't have the results before November 30, and even if we did, we would still need the board to meet and approve the forecast that I submit. So kind of in a catch-22. We need to submit something and we can always amend it.
So what I was going to ask is, we will know tomorrow morning not only whether or not we need a recount, but we will probably know the date that that recount's going to occur. And the attorneys have told us two things. Number one, that they're going to push that occurs as quickly as possible, before the end of the month, if possible. That's what everybody is hoping for, is that it's before the end of the month. But that also, number two, based on the way that Franklin County votes, it is almost certain that things would not change after a recount. So the way that Franklin County votes, we don't use manual, we don't use optical scan. Everything is an electronic ballot. And so there's no, I don't remember what the percentage was, but the percentage likelihood of things changing in a recount are exceptionally low. So we should know tomorrow morning, I guess, not only whether or not we have a recount, but hopefully when that recount will be. And I guess that was where I was headed with my question. So if we know that we have a mandatory recount, but we're up, I'm trying to understand why the state, is it the state that requires us to submit the forecast as if we are losing, as if we failed it?
No, it's just that ODE requires submission by November 30th. And you're not, legally, I cannot include revenues that have not been.
So they certify the results tomorrow, that they will certify. And if we're up, they will certify that we have passed the levy. And if we're too close, they will be certifying that we passed and that we have to have a mandatory recount. But the certification, if we pass it, would be that it passed. Mm-hmm. So that, I'm just trying to, it's probably splitting hairs, and it probably also, we're going to have lots more information tomorrow morning. I'm just trying to understand if the certification is that we have passed it, why we would be required to submit a forecast saying that we didn't.
Yeah, I think we can check with attorneys that they could give us an answer tomorrow.
Okay.
On
okay.
That. Like
okay. Yeah, and let's wait and see.
Yeah, that we should. Results. What I meant is the recount should be done by November 30, Mike. So even if we have to schedule a special meeting, that'll be a nice meeting to have to recommend and approve a forecast that is, much more positive than filing one and then having to refile it. So I don't know, it's up to the board, but I think we may, if we don't have definitive answer tomorrow, we may want to wait and have a special meeting rather than file something and then refile it. But I don't know. That's something to think about. We'll know more tomorrow.
We also need to be cognizant of the calendar, right? Next Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, I don't think people are in the office.
Right.
And Monday, the
It's the
following
30th.
Monday is the 30th.
There's one other thing I wanted to bring up, Mike. So we thought we were going to, if the levy passed, we thought we were going to have to do a resolution for the bond, right? And we found out from Bricker and Eckler that we're not going to have to do that. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? That requirement?
Well, it was, discussed on a conference call, what did we have, about a week ago?
Yeah. And there was an email as well from Bricker and Eckler.
So typically, my understanding is the next step after passing the levy is we would need to follow with the county and pass a resolution in order to move forward with the bond issue. And I guess they investigated and determined that the auditor does not require us to do that. So therefore, we don't need to have like an emergency meeting before November.
I think it's normally required, but given the situation we're in with the possible recount, we're maybe not going to, and the holiday and all of that, we're not going to be required to do that, from my understanding. So that's a good thing. The good news is that, if things hold up and it passes, we want to get moving as quickly as possible, and work with our bond folks and, retain an architect to go through all the legal processes to do that and begin the planning phases for the additions at the elementary, middle school, and then the high school. The hope is that we've been saying it's 24 months of planning, 24 months to build, but we think we can we've reduced the planning time a little bit to between 20 and 18 months, and then begin the high school project in sometime in the spring of 22, and then for a finish date of the fall of 24. So all exciting stuff. We're hoping for a good result tomorrow.
For sure. Okay. Any other discussion around the 5-year forecast? So we had to present both tonight. I know it was a lot, but I think it really paves the way for what direction we have to take in either situation. So thank you for bearing with us through the process. Any other thoughts you wanted to share, Mike?
No, I think I'm good.
Okay. All right. Last call for questions from the board. All good? All right. We will see you all on Thursday evening then. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.